Like many other teachers, multimedia has played a pivotal role in my classroom. And to put it frankly, according to Richard Meyer, a cognitive psychologist, the multimedia principle states that humans learn best from words and pictures than just words alone. And in this day and age, when multimedia in learning can come in many different forms like animations, video, photos, text, graphs, narration, music, and more, it can be hard to know how to use them appropriately. Due to this abundance of free and widely accessible Web 2.0 tools, etc., it's easy for teachers to load lessons with multimedia. And while using multimedia can be extremely beneficial, there are many areas where too much can actually hurt and hinder learning. If you are a teacher who takes advantage of multimedia's rewarding benefits, this presentation will inform you on how to maximize the use of these tools to enhance instruction. This is also achieved by recognizing that multimedia can overwhelm, distract, or disrupt the flow of learning, especially in a time when multimedia has played a pivotal role in remote learning during the pandemic, and how it continues to still play a role in education. There are three major goals of multimedia principle of learning. These goals are to cut out extraneous load, manage the essential processing, and foster generative processing. Each of these three things is essential in learning, as learners have limited amounts of processing capacity in their visual and auditory channels. Meyer explains there are two channels humans use for learning. This visual channel processes images, motion, pictures, and text, and the auditory channel for sound, including narration. To avoid overwhelming these channels, multimedia should not be overused in a way that disrupts learning. So we can support learning by reducing the extraneous cognitive load by supporting four principles of multimedia learning. The first is coherence principle, which states while people learn better when both pictures and text are present, rather than just only text, it is important to focus on using media that is absolutely relevant to the goal of the lesson. Everything else is considered extra and requires more processing from one or both of the learning channels, and potentially overwhelming them. Some extraneous load examples that I have been guilty of adding are extra video clips that don't support the underlying goal of the lesson. I include them because they are visually cool and may add to the lesson, but they're not actually essential to the learning. So one strategy I've learned is to omit the video or use just a small clip and then ask direct questions that bring it back to the supporting learning goal. The second principle, known as the contiguity principle, will also reduce cognitive load through proximity of visual and text together. Many times the design of a lesson that is using a visual and text explaining the visual may not be close enough in proximity to the visual due to a page break, misuse, or negligence. So it confuses and slows the learner, which causes them to have to focus harder on irrelevant tasks. While the information might very well be somewhere on the slide and accessible to the learner, this doesn't mean that it will quickly or correctly be interpreted. But aligning words next to their corresponding graphics or sometimes on top of the graphic can make it easier or help reduce the cognitive load. Narration can also be a useful tool with visuals, particularly animations and video. The modality principle makes good use of this, which is when two modes, visual and auditory, are used to enhance learning. For example, using narration with an animation will maximize both the mental processing channels and essential processing. And like the contiguity principle, the narration should match exactly what's being shown in the video or animation. By using text with narration together, this will reduce the extraneous processing because having the two together is redundant. Hence the next strategy in reducing the cognitive load. This is known as redundancy principle. By including both written text and an animation creates unnecessary eye traffic off the visual and onto the text. This unnecessarily clogs the visual channel, so pick one and stick with it. That said, there is a small group of learners who will benefit from the redundancy principle. For example, second language learners who need the extra written and spoken word. The hearing impaired will benefit from captioning as well. Lastly, if the learner is controlling the pace of the instruction, which will provide them more time on each of the lesson's components. There is still room outside of the boundary if you do decide to use some text with the narration, but you will want to consider these rules that I mentioned in the contiguity principle, that all text should be in proximity of the visual. Additionally, following the coherence principle by only including text that is supporting the learning goal. In most cases with narration, the text should just be titles or short phrases. After cognitive load has been addressed, to get learners maximizing their essential processing, it can be helpful to use the personalization principle. This principle focuses on using conversational style tone versus a formal one in the narration. This is because the multimedia material will be more human-like than a set of instructions on a computer. Using words like you and I are a great way to include both the instructor and the learner into the lesson, together like a team. In addition to using a conversational tone, using polite language should also be considered because this gives the learner permission to proceed and encourages them in their learning. A branch of the personalization principle is the embodiment principle, which is having a teacher like figure on the screen so there is more of a human like character present other than the computer for the learner to visually interact with. These characters can be in the forms of cartoons or video. Good ones are animated with body and include facial expressions. Other ways to improve the learning of the essential material, especially if the material is complex, is to provide the learner with some pre training. This can come in the form of things like a vocabulary list before the complex lesson. This can also help reduce the cognitive load by shifting some of the processing into the pre training practice. An additional way to ease up on the cognitive load for essential material is to scaffold a lesson. This is also known as segmenting. This means to break down the complex learning into bit-sized chunks that won't overwhelm the learner. In multimedia, this can be done in the form of a learner-paced lesson when the learner decides to move on. As a new or experienced teacher, it is hard to avoid even the smallest degree of multimedia in your lesson. With curated YouTube channels, images, graphs, and text, it is probably evident that the learners in your classroom have no doubt benefited from your thought in the instructional design of your lessons with multimedia. Remember that you are working to cut the extraneous load to maximize the essential learning through the dual processing channels, and all the resources should be used in a way that supports the instructional goal and doesn't cause speed bumps for your learners. While your learners are most likely at different levels of learning, it still is important to consider these principles the next time you create your multimedia lessons.